welcome to the deep dive. Today we are looking at a text that is, without a doubt, one of the most highly provocative, deeply polarizing, and just fiercely debated books currently circulating in the cultural undercurrents right now.
Yeah, it is. It is certainly a text that does not pull any punches. It's engineered from the ground up to challenge the most deeply held foundational assumptions of modern Western society.
Exactly. So I am talking directly to you, the listener. If you are someone who wants to know exactly what is driving these massive tectonic shifts we're seeing right now, if you've been paying attention to the intense debates about masculinity, the fundamental structure of our institutions, and the growing pushback against mainstream media narratives, you're going to want to eliminate all distractions and really listen to this one.
Because it goes deep. It really attempts to redefine the map of how we understand human organization.
It really does.
Yeah.
And before we get into the heavy philosophical lifting, just a quick piece of housekeeping. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the show wherever you are currently listening. Taking that 2 seconds to hit subscribe is what allows us to keep bringing you these deep, unfiltered, and comprehensive analyses.
Right. It helps us a lot.
It does. And today's deep dive is a full review of a newly released ebook titled Divine Natural Order. Implicate order, so above as below, self, holons, archetypes, and synchronicity. It is written by Conrad Riker.
It is quite a title.
Yeah, a very dense title. And if, as we go through this, you decide you want to read the source material and examine these arguments for yourself, you can check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book. We also highly recommend you follow the author directly at the handle at Conrad Riker on Substack to see his ongoing essays.
Now, before we begin to unpack the incredibly dense architecture of Riker's arguments, we really need to lay down a very explicit, very important disclaimer.
Yes, absolutely. This is a critical directive for how we approach this material today.
Right. Our mission today is strictly to deconstruct the core philosophical, biological, and societal arguments made in this book.
We must explicitly state up front that this book contains highly politically charged content. It is tailored heavily toward men's rights and what is often called a red-pilled perspective.
Very much so.
And we want to make it crystal clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides here. We are not endorsing the viewpoints presented in the text, and we are not validating the political ideology behind them.
That is exactly right. Our job is strictly to act as impartial guides through a very complex landscape. We are here to synthesize the data the author presents and explain how he views the history of modern institutions, specifically through a deeply anti-feminist and anti-Marxist lens.
We're basically exploring the map he has drawn of the world.
Right. We want to understand the terrain as he sees it, specifically how he claims these institutions function before they were, in his words, captured by these ideologies.
We are taking the tour, we're analyzing the architecture, but we are not buying the real estate.
Perfect way to put it.
So, to set the philosophical stage, where does Riker even begin? Because looking at the title alone, he brings in a really unique, almost dizzying blend of concepts. I mean, we are talking quantum physics, ancient philosophy, evolutionary biology, all just smashed together to form a critique of modern society.
It's an incredibly ambitious synthesis.
Yeah.
And he doesn't start with politics or culture at all, which is interesting. He starts with physics. He starts with systems theory.
Okay.
Conrad Riker builds his entire worldview on two foundational scientific concepts. And he makes it clear that if you don't understand these, the rest of the book simply won't make sense. First, he borrows heavily from the renowned mid-century quantum physicist David Bohm. Specifically, he focuses on Bohm's concept of the implicate order.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think for a lot of people, quantum mechanics feels completely disconnected from a sociological critique. What exactly is the implicate order in this context?
Right, so in Bohmian mechanics, the universe isn't just a collection of separate objects bumping into each other randomly. Bohm proposed that there is a deeper, hidden, and folded structure beneath the visible reality we interact with every day.
The stuff we can actually see and touch.
Exactly. He called the reality, we see the explicate order, the unfolded visible stuff. But beneath that is the implicate order, an undivided wholeness, where everything is connected by underlying mathematical and physical laws.
So there's a blueprint.
Yes, a literal blueprint to reality. And Riker takes this concept and applies it directly to human existence. He argues that biology, human psychology, and societal structures are governed by this invisible, immutable structure. You can't just invent a new way for humans to organize themselves because you feel like it, or because a sociology professor thinks it's a good idea. You have to align with the implicate order, or the system fails.
So he's saying there is a hardwired code to reality and we ignore it at our own peril.
Precisely.
And what is the second foundational concept he pairs with this?
The second is Arthur Koestler's concept of holons. Koestler was this fascinating polymath, and he coined this term to describe a very specific type of structure in nature. A holon is an entity that is simultaneously a whole unto itself and a part of a larger whole.
Wait, so if I'm understanding Riker correctly here, he's basically saying society is built like a set of Russian nesting dolls.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it, yes.
Yeah.
Think of a biological cell. A cell is a complete functioning unit. It has its own walls, its own energy production, its own DNA. It is a whole.
Right.
But simultaneously, that cell is just one tiny part of the human liver. The liver is a whole organ, but it is just one part of the digestive system. The digestive system is a part of the human body. Riker takes this biological reality and maps it directly onto human society.
So mapping that to people, what does that look like?
In his framework, a single man is a whole individual, but he's also a holon, a part of the family holon. The family is part of the community holon. The community is part of the nation holon.
And if one of those Russian nesting dolls is misshapen or broken, the whole stack doesn't fit together properly. It introduces instability into the entire structure.
Precisely. And this leads directly into section 1 of the book, which is his absolute, unequivocal rejection of equality.
This is where it gets really spicy.
It does. Riker takes Bohm's hidden order and Koestler's nesting dolls to make his central, most controversial thesis. He states that nature is inherently hierarchical. It is a series of nested hierarchies, which he calls a holarchy.
A holarchy.
Right. Therefore, to pretend that human beings are naturally egalitarian is not just naive, he argues. It is biologically destructive. He believes the universe runs on hierarchy, and equality of outcome is a biological fiction.
I want to stop you there because that is a massive philosophical leap. He is taking quantum physics and cellular biology and using them to say that social equality is a total myth. How exactly does he justify mapping those dynamics onto everyday human environments?
He does it by arguing that complexity literally requires inequality. He states that a flat system, where every node has equal power and equal say, simply cannot sustain complex life or execute complex tasks. He makes this incredibly stark by comparing two totally different environments.
Yeah, the wolf pack example.
Yes. In one chapter, he describes in this vivid sensory detail observing a wolf pack taking down a bull elk in the Rocky Mountains.
He paints quite a picture there. He talks about how silent and perfectly coordinated the hunt is. The alpha male leads the primary charge, making the high-risk strategic moves. The beta wolves flank the prey to cut off escape routes, and the omega wolf, the lowest in the hierarchy, stays back entirely.
And Riker's point in highlighting this is the sheer brutal efficiency of it. There are no focus groups in the snow. There are no pauses to build consensus among the wolves.
Right, nobody's taking a vote.
Exactly. There are no HR complaints from the Omega Wolf about feeling marginalized or left out of the high-status flanking maneuver. It is a strict, ruthless, undeniable hierarchy. But because of that hierarchy, the entire pack survives. The pack eats. It is a highly functional holon.
And then he contrasts that functional natural hierarchy with a deeply unnatural one, his own experience working in a Portland tech company. He says this company prided itself on having a flat hierarchy, which is, a massive buzzword in corporate culture right now.
He describes it as a workplace utterly paralyzed by egalitarianism. He talks about daily morning check-ins that lasted over an hour, where people sat around and shared their emotional states and personal roadblocks before any actual work even began.
The hex color code story is wild.
It really is.
Yeah.
He describes weeks, literally weeks spent debating the exact hex color code of a progress bar font because they needed absolute consensus from every single department so no one felt creatively stifled.
And he mentions HR complaints over what he calls triggers, right? Like someone using a specific word in a Slack channel that required a 3-day mediation process.
Yes. In Riker's view, this Portland tech company had inverted the natural order entirely. They prioritized emotional consensus and the illusion of equality over the actual function of the business, which is productivity and output.
And the result was zero actual output and massive internal resentment.
But he doesn't just rely on personal anecdotes about annoying tech meetings. He backs this up with some heavy empirical data. He points to a 2022 MIT study that looked at high-stress, high-stakes environments.
We're talking military special forces units, emergency room trauma teams, and elite firefighting squads.
That MIT study is foundational to his argument. The researchers compared teams that operated on a strict, unquestioned command hierarchy against teams that attempted to use democratic, consensus-based decision-making models.
And the findings are wild. The clear, rigid hierarchy outperformed the consensus models by a massive 68% in both speed and accuracy of task completion.
What's fascinating here is how Riker interprets that specific data point. He argues that when lives are literally on the line, or when a system is facing an existential threat and needs to survive, communication overhead has to be ruthlessly eliminated.
You cannot hold a vote on how to intubate a crashing patient.
Exactly. You cannot have a roundtable discussion on how to put out a five-alarm fire. Someone has to command, and others have to instantly obey. The MIT study for Riker proves that equality is a luxury of safe, stagnant environments. In the real world, hierarchy is survival.
And he broadens this out to the natural world again, pointing out that fractal hierarchies are everywhere. He looks at ant colonies, the mathematical perfection of the Mandelbrot set, and even human anatomy.
The lungs are a great example he uses.
Yeah, he points out that the branching of human lungs has 23 distinct hierarchical levels from the trachea all the way down to the tiny alveoli.
Right, the lungs aren't a flat network of equal tubes. They're a descending hierarchy of specialized parts. Flat networks fail to process complex information. Hierarchies scale. Therefore, Riker argues, enforcing equality of outcome in human society is what he calls entropy disguised as virtue.
Wow.
Yeah, he says it actively breaks the implicate order.
Entropy disguised as virtue. That is a heavy phrase. He's really saying that the modern push for equity isn't just misguided, it is a force of chaos trying to dismantle the mathematical structure of life itself. And he hammers this home by looking at the human cost of trying to erase that order, specifically in children.
This is where his argument gets very personal and very dark. He cites a 2021 study out of the University of Aarhus in Denmark. The researchers conducted a long-term observational study following children who were raised in deliberately gender-erased or radically egalitarian homes.
Right, these were environments where the parents completely swapped or intentionally erased traditional maternal and paternal roles. They refused to use the words mom or dad with their traditional archetypal weight.
They were trying to present themselves to the child as two completely interchangeable equal co-guardians with no distinct hierarchical authority.
And the data from Aarhus was alarming. By the time those children reached 12 years of age, 42% of them were exhibiting symptoms of clinical anxiety, requiring some form of intervention.
42%. That is an incredibly high baseline for clinical anxiety in preteens.
It really is.
Riker views that not as a statistical anomaly, but as psychological sabotage. To him, tying it back to Koestler, the family is the foundational holon of human existence. A child's psyche requires a predictable, structured hierarchy to feel safe.
They need to know who is in charge.
Exactly. If you invert or erase the hierarchy within that unit, if you force an unnatural sameness where nature demands differentiation in specific roles, the system cannot hold its shape. It collapses into anxiety, confusion, and disorder.
So it's fascinating how he views the family as this atomic unit. But what happens when you scale that up? If the family is collapsing according to his data, how does he think that manifests in our broader institutions? Because Riker doesn't just stop at tech companies and experimental parenting in Denmark.
No, he takes it much further.
This brings us right into section 2, which is his historical and societal diagnosis. And he centers this entire collapse on a concept he calls gynocentrism.
Yes, for you, the listener, it's crucial to understand how Riker defines this term, because it is the lens through which he views all modern history. Riker defines gynocentrism as the captured state of Western institutions, where female whims, emotional comfort, and the avoidance of offense are placed above the natural functional order of society.
So feeling safe is prioritized over being effective.
Exactly. In his framework, the West has suffered a massive holonic inversion. Instead of logic, structure, and merit ruling over emotion, emotion and consensus now dictate policy, law, and corporate behavior.
And he argues this isn't the first time this has happened in history. He goes all the way back to the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece to make this point.
He does, and it's a very specific reading of history. He contrasts the two great city-states, Athens and Sparta. In the modern popular imagination, Athens is often glorified as the pinnacle of democracy and philosophy, while Sparta is viewed as a brutal, one-dimensional military camp.
Oh, right. We all think of the Spartans from the movies.
But Riker flips this narrative entirely.
How so?
He argues that Athens ultimately fell and was conquered because it succumbed to what he terms effeminacy and emotional indulgence. He claims that as Athens grew wealthy, it replaced stoic resolve and strict hierarchical duty with endless debate, emotional pandering, and a soft, egalitarian mindset.
Basically a giant ancient Greek HR department.
Pretty much. He argues they outsource the moral and physical formation of their youth to the domestic sphere, rather than the grueling, structured environments led by fathers.
While in contrast, he says Sparta endured for centuries longer because it strictly maintained the masculine imperative.
Exactly. The Spartan Holland functioned, in his view, because it placed duty, brutal discipline, and absolute hierarchy above any sentimentality. If you were weak, the system did not accommodate you. The system demanded you conform to the hierarchy or perish. Riker uses this historical binary to suggest that the modern West is behaving exactly like late-stage Athens.
But he doesn't just leave it as a historical theory. He pulls evolutionary psychology into the mix to explain the actual biological mechanics of why this shift happens. And he leans on some controversial figures here, including the 19th century philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer.
Schopenhauer famously, or notoriously, wrote essays arguing that women are biologically meant to deceive because they lack the physical strength to dominate through direct force. Now, modern academics usually dismiss this as archaic misogyny.
Right.
But Riker frames this not as an insult, but as a brilliant early observation of an evolutionary survival strategy.
He says that if you are the physically weaker sex in a brutal prehistoric environment, direct physical confrontation is suicidal. So evolution selects for a different kind of warfare. And to prove this isn't just a 19th century philosophical musing, he brings in some very recent science.
He bolsters Schopenhauer's philosophy with hard ethology. He cites a fascinating 2019 set of primate studies out of Cambridge University. The researchers were observing the social dynamics of large groups of female baboons.
And what did they find? Because the way Riker describes it, it sounds like Mean Girls on the savannah.
That's essentially the comparison he makes. The study showed that these female primates actively use indirect aggression to establish and maintain dominance.
Indirect aggression.
Yes. Instead of ripping each other apart physically like the males might, the females form exclusive cliques. They execute coordinated reputational attacks by shunning specific individuals, and they socially isolate rivals to cut them off from resources.
So they don't use physical violence.
No, they use social manipulation and ostracization.
And Riker connects this primate behavior directly to modern human behavior. He argues that modern women, and by extension, the institutions they now heavily influence or control, use these exact same biological strategies. He claims that female deception, indirect aggression, and hypergamy, which is the evolutionary drive to seek a mate of higher status and discard lower status males, are not social constructs created by the patriarchy.
He says they are hardwired, unchangeable evolutionary software.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the book, Riker is claiming that modern institutions, specifically human resources departments in the corporate world, family court systems, and broad social movements like Me Too, have effectively institutionalized this primate indirect aggression.
That is a staggering accusation.
He's saying HR departments are basically institutionalized baboon cliques.
In his framework, yes. He argues that these systems have weaponized the concept of victimhood. Instead of a system based on merit and direct confrontation, the corporate world has become a playground for social sabotage.
So how does that play out for men in these environments? He argues that today, a highly competent, high-producing man can be fired and have his entire career destroyed, not because he failed at his job, but simply because a woman in the office felt uncomfortable or claimed emotional distress. Riker sees this as the ultimate holonic inversion. The emotional comfort of the female is treated as the highest constitutional standard of the organization, overriding competence and logic.
And nowhere does he see this dynamic as more destructive or more heartbreaking than in the collapse of the family home.
This is where his data becomes incredibly sobering, regardless of where you stand politically. He dedicates a massive section of the book to the crisis of fatherlessness, pointing to deeply troubling U.S. Department of Justice statistics.
The numbers he pulls are staggering. He points out that boys raised in homes without a biological father are 5 times more likely to suffer from severe clinical depression.
5 times.
And even worse, they are 6 times more likely to end up incarcerated in the prison system.
Riker uses those statistics to argue that fatherhood isn't just a social role or a part-time gig that can be swapped out with a government program. He writes that the father's presence is structural. It is like gravity in the family Holland.
If you remove the father, the structure loses its anchor and flies apart into chaos, depression, and criminality.
I want to take a breath here because when you say 6 times more likely to be incarcerated, that is a devastating indictment of a system that normalizes broken homes. And Riker doesn't just leave it at abstract statistics, he grounds it with a very intense personal anecdote about a man he calls Jason K.
The story of Jason K is used to illustrate the cold, bureaucratic machinery of the family court system. Jason is described as a hardworking guy from Cortland. He was fully invested in his family, practicing exactly the kind of 50-50 shared parenting that modern society demands. He is highly involved.
Right.
But according to the book, his wife simply gets bored. She experiences what Riker links back to hypergamy and leaves Jason for a yoga instructor who presents a novel, exciting lifestyle.
And the way the court handles this is what really fuels Riker's argument. Jason didn't abuse his wife, he didn't abandon his kids, yet the court awards the mother primary, overwhelming custody of the children, and the financial hammer drops on Jason. He is ordered to pay $3,200 a month in child support and alimony.
Which Riker points out is more than Jason's own rent for his small apartment. Furthermore, Jason is reduced to seeing his own children for only 4 days out of the entire month every other weekend.
So he essentially becomes a visitor in his children's lives while bankrolling the woman who blew up the family Holland.
For Riker, Jason's story is the perfect microcosm of how the state and the legal system view men today. They do not see fathers as the architectural, necessary anchors of the family structure. The family courts, which Riker claims are deeply infected by gynocentrism, view men merely as disposable income or utility nodes.
Just ATMs.
Basically,
Yeah.
the natural hierarchy is violently severed by the state, the father is stripped of his leadership and reduced to an ATM, and the mother is legally elevated to the status of an untouchable emotional monarch.
Okay, so if evolutionary psychology and what he calls gynocentrism are the biological drivers of this societal collapse, how does he view the political and economic drivers? Because a system doesn't just change organically. There are usually ideological frameworks pushing it along.
Right.
This brings us to section 3 of his book and his deeply aggressive critique of Marxism and corporate DEI policies.
Yes, and this is where his synthesis gets very intricate. Riker frames classical Marxism and its modern corporate equivalent DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, in a very non-traditional way. He does not view them as legitimate economic theories about wealth distribution, nor does he view DEI as a genuine sociological attempt to right historical wrongs.
How does he view them then?
He views them as a priesthood of envy.
A priesthood of envy. That is an incredibly loaded phrase. It strips away the academic veneer completely.
It implies a religious, cult-like devotion to resentment. In Riker's analysis, envy is not just wanting what someone else has. It is a destructive desire to tear down anyone who is superior to you. He argues that Marxist ideologies actively and intentionally dismantle the hierarchy.
How exactly?
They do this by replacing the natural law of competence with the synthetic law of identity.
Right. So in a healthy Holon, the system rewards the specific node, the person that performs its function the absolute best, regardless of who they are.
Exactly. But under the priesthood of envy, the system stops rewarding competence. Instead, it rewards individuals based entirely on their demographic status or their rank on a hierarchy of perceived historical victimhood. Riker argues this is suicidal for a complex society.
And once again, he brings the receipts to back up his philosophical claims. He cites a major 2023 study out of Stanford University that looked directly at team performance in corporate environments.
The Stanford study was designed to measure the actual output of two different types of teams. They look at merit-based teams, which were groups assembled purely on the basis of raw technical skill, experience, and past performance, with zero regard for the race, gender, or background of the participants.
And the other group.
Then they compared them to diversity-mandated teams, where the members were specifically chosen to fulfill demographic quotas and represent a broad cross-section of identities.
And the performance gap wasn't even close. The merit-based teams outperformed the diversity-mandated teams by 58% in sheer innovation and 44% in overall operational efficiency.
To Riker, this isn't surprising. It is fundamental physics. If you mandate diversity of identity over the concentration of technical skill, you are forcibly introducing entropy chaos into the system. You are prioritizing the public appearance of fairness over the actual reality of function.
Tying it back to the wolves.
Exactly. He ties this back to the wolf pack. You need the absolute best, strongest wolves at the front of the pack. If you force the omega wolf to lead the hunt for the sake of equity, the pack starves. Complexity requires inequality because you need the best people in the hardest roles.
So if the data is this clear, how does this ideology spread? How does it get so thoroughly embedded in the culture that companies are willing to lose 44% efficiency just to comply with it?
Storytelling.
Right. Riker argues that the vector for this virus is modern storytelling and the media. He takes his critique straight to the heart of the entertainment industry, specifically targeting Disney.
Riker dedicates a significant portion of his analysis to the financial and cultural decline of the Walt Disney Company. He notes that Disney recently lost roughly $70 billion in market value over a relatively short period. While financial analysts might blame market conditions or streaming competition, Riker diagnoses a different disease.
He claims they abandoned the blueprint of human psychology.
Yes. He points to Joseph Campbell's concept of the hero's journey. For thousands of years, the hero's journey has been the fundamental structure of human storytelling. It is a deeply hierarchical, meritocratic structure. A young man faces a terrifying unknown, undergoes brutal struggle, suffers, develops competence, and ultimately achieves triumph, returning to stabilize his community.
Earning his place.
Yes, it is a narrative of earning your place in the hierarchy.
But Riker says modern Disney and Hollywood at large has entirely replaced the hero's journey with compliance to woke ideology. He argues they stopped writing stories about earning competence and started writing stories where female characters are simply inherently perfect from the beginning, requiring no struggle, while male characters are portrayed as either bumbling idiots or oppressive villains.
He views this as deliberate cultural sabotage. The priesthood of envy knows that to change the culture, you must change the myths the culture consumes. He contrasts modern Hollywood's output to prove his point. He looks specifically at critically acclaimed films like Promising Young Woman.
That's the film where the female protagonist basically goes around feigning extreme vulnerability to trap men and exact revenge.
Correct. Riker argues that the cultural elite praise this film because it glorifies female deception, emotional manipulation, and indirect aggression, the exact behaviors observed in the Cambridge primate studies. Hollywood frames this manipulative vengeance as empowerment.
Right, while on the flip side, he looks at male-driven justice narratives. He uses the John Wick franchise as an example. John Wick is essentially a hyper-competent male archetype executing direct physical justice against a corrupt system.
But how is that received?
Well, Riker points out this type of traditional male vengeance and protection plot is heavily critiqued by mainstream media outlets and cultural academics as a glorification of toxic masculinity.
He sees a very clear, deliberate agenda here. The media Holland is attempting to glorify female emotional tyranny and manipulation, while simultaneously demonizing and pathologizing traditional male archetypes of protection, direct confrontation, and objective justice.
Which raises an incredibly important question for the listener. We spent this entire time outlining Riker's diagnosis. If the media, the family courts, the corporate HR departments, and the schools are all captured by this inverted hierarchy, if the priesthood of envy is running the show, what is an individual man actually supposed to do?
Right. What's the solution?
Riker doesn't just diagnose the disease. Section 4 is where he prescribes a deeply traditional, heavily intellectual weapon to fight it.
He does. He argues that complaining on the internet is useless. He prescribes a return to classical education, specifically urging men to master what is known as the trivium.
For those who might not have a classical education background, the trivium is the ancient foundational structure of learning consisting of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Riker basically tells his readers, forget modern therapy. Forget trying to explain your feelings to a system that hates you. You need to master the trivium to systematically dismantle ideological lies.
Let's break down exactly how he applies this as a martial art.
It starts with grammar. Now, in the classical sense, grammar isn't just about making sure your commas are in the right place. It is about the absolute precision of language. It is about defining your terms so clearly that deception becomes impossible. Riker insists that men must force their ideological opponents to clearly define their words before engaging in any debate.
He gives a really potent example of this in action. He describes a hypothetical or perhaps real interaction with a modern teacher who declares, as a matter of unquestionable dogma, that using someone's preferred pronouns is a fundamental human right.
And Riker's prescribed response is not to get angry, but to use grammar. He says you must force that teacher to define what a right actually is in a legal and philosophical sense.
Make them articulate it.
Exactly. Furthermore, if the debate is about gender, you force them to define what a woman is. Riker argues that modern leftist ideology relies entirely on linguistic ambiguity. They weaponize terms like equity or safety without ever defining them. If you allow the opposition to redefine reality through fluid language, you have already lost the war before the first shot is fired. You must pin down their definitions.
So grammar is the foundation. You secure the perimeter of the argument. Then comes the second pillar, logic, specifically the use of the syllogism.
Yes. Once the terms are defined, you apply logic. He leans heavily on Aristotle's law of non-contradiction, the foundational philosophical principle that a statement and its direct opposite cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense.
And he uses this logic to absolutely hammer the modern concept of male privilege.
He constructs a devastating syllogism using hard demographic data. He says, look at the reality of society. If men die, on average, 5 years earlier than women, if men make up an astonishing 93% of all workplace fatalities because they work the most dangerous infrastructure jobs, if men serve vastly longer prison sentences for the exact same crimes, and if men lose child custody in family courts 80% of the time, then the foundational structural premise that Western society is a patriarchy rigged to blindly privilege men logically collapses.
It violates the law of non-contradiction. A system cannot be designed to privilege a group while simultaneously ensuring that group suffers the vast majority of its fatalities, incarcerations, and familial alienations.
It is literally treating logic as an offensive weapon, and once you have grammar and logic, you move to the final piece, rhetoric.
In classical education, rhetoric is the art of persuasion. But in Riker's toolkit, rhetoric is primarily defensive. It is the trained ability to instantly identify, expose, and neutralize emotional manipulation.
Because he argues that once you defeat someone with logic, they will inevitably pivot to emotion.
Exactly. When an ideological opponent is cornered by a syllogism and they realize their argument has failed, they will rarely admit defeat. Instead, they will resort to crying, shaming, calling you a bigot, or claiming that your logic makes them feel unsafe. They use victimhood to try and win the argument. The man trained in Riker's version of rhetoric does not take the bait. He identifies that emotional outburst not as a valid counterargument, but as blatant emotional blackmail. He names the tactic, neutralizes it, and refuses to concede ground.
And we are seeing the results of this intellectual arming in real time. Riker points to the massive, undeniable rise of the alternative media holon. He looks at figures who have built empires on this exact type of debate style.
He specifically points to public intellectuals like Dr. Jordan Peterson and debate heavyweights like Ben Shapiro. But beyond just individuals, he looks at the broader alternative podcast ecosystem, which currently pulls in over 50 million downloads a month.
50 million. That is not a fringe movement. That is a parallel economy of information.
Riker sees this as absolute empirical proof that men are abandoning mainstream legacy media. They recognize that the legacy networks are thoroughly gynocentric and hostile to male logic. So they are using the trivium to build their own massive intellectual holon.
It is a profound cultural shift. Riker argues that these alternative media figures aren't popular because they are angry or hateful, which is how the mainstream media portrays them. He says they are popular because they are speaking objective reality in a system that has been built entirely on emotional illusions. They are helping young men use logic to shatter the monopoly of the priesthood of envy.
But as we move into Section 5, Riker makes a significant pivot. He argues that while intellectual defense is necessary, it is not sufficient. You cannot just think your way out of a collapsing civilization.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting, because Section 5 is a massive, visceral call to physical action. Riker tells his readers that they need to abandon the digital plantation. Stop wasting your energy arguing with bots on Twitter, stop swiping endlessly on soul-crushing dating apps, and physically rebuild the male holon in the real world. He distills his masculine imperative down to 4 primal words: lead, build, protect, dominate.
And this isn't just theoretical bravado. He provides tangible, real-world data and examples showing that this reclamation is happening right now across the country. He points to a recent 23% surge in male entrepreneurship, specifically men moving out of the corporate laptop class and into the skilled physical trades.
These are guys who are quitting high-paying, but ultimately spiritually empty and politically toxic corporate jobs. They are walking away from the flat hierarchies and HR mediations to become blacksmiths, master welders, custom carpenters, and electricians. They are choosing hard, physical reality over digital illusions.
He highlights a specific, fascinating phenomenon to illustrate this, a place called the Iron Hearth Retreat in the deep woods of Idaho.
The story of Iron Hearth is wild. Riker describes it vividly. It's run by a former military special operator, and the clientele isn't who you'd expect. It's tech bros from Silicon Valley, divorced middle managers, men completely burned out by algorithms and corporate speak.
They show up in Idaho, and immediately the digital world is stripped away. They chop cords of wood until their hands bleed, They immerse themselves in freezing rivers for cold plunge therapy to shock their nervous systems back online. And most importantly, the retreat enforces strict earned hierarchies. You do not get a say in the schedule. You follow orders from the men who have proven their competence.
And the most incredible detail about Ironheart is their number one rule. They completely ban all therapy speak.
Yes. The operators of the retreat recognize that modern psychological terminology has often been weaponized to excuse weakness. So, there is no trauma dumping. There is no sitting in a circle discussing your inner child or your anxious attachment style. If you want to talk about your pain, you are handed an axe, and you don't speak until you've split a cord of wood.
Riker views these retreats not as hubs of toxic masculinity, but as a desperately needed immune response. He says the culture has pathologized normal male aggression and hierarchy, and men are building these spaces to cure themselves of the societal sickness. He also points to sprawling grassroots organizations like F3 Nation.
F3 stands for Fitness, Fellowship, and Faith. It's a rapidly growing network of men's workout groups that meet in local parks at 5 a.m. in the pitch black, regardless of the weather. Rain, snow, or heat, they're out there doing grueling physical workouts.
And it's completely free, completely led by volunteers, and completely hierarchical. But Riker emphasizes that this physical reclamation isn't just about pushing iron with your buddies, it's about passing the architecture of the Holon on to the next generation. This brings up the story of Ray.
Ray is a father in rural Texas that Riker profiles. Ray looked at the culture his 3 teenage sons were marinating in the screens, the apathy, the lack of real-world consequence, and decided to intervene. He bought a plot of land and decided to build a log cabin with his sons, completely by hand.
And the key detail here, no power tools, no nail guns, no electric saws, only hand tools, drawn knives, and sweat.
Riker describes how Ray uses this grueling process to teach his sons profound philosophical lessons through physical reality. He teaches them precision and structural alignment. He teaches them that nature does not negotiate with your feelings. If a joint isn't squared perfectly, if the math is wrong, the roof will leak and you will freeze. It doesn't matter how you feel about the joint. Nature demands objective competence. It is a physical initiation into manhood that the modern world has entirely stripped away.
This is a perfect example of what Riker terms the fractal father. The idea is that when a father enforces strict, uncompromising, yet deeply loving discipline, when he teaches his sons objective competence, he isn't just fixing his own kids. That action replicates. It ripples out across time and scale, stabilizing the community, the state, and eventually the broader civilization. The father is the anchor of the implicate order.
To help men navigate this process of becoming an anchor, Riker provides an internal psychological map. He leans on the work of Jungian psychoanalysts to revive 4 ancient foundational male archetypes: the warrior, the magician, the lover, and the king.
Let's break those down because they are often misunderstood.
Absolutely. The warrior archetype, in Riker's definition, is not about chaotic, toxic rage or starting bar fights. The true warrior is about strategic dominance, the mastery of physical and mental discipline, and the willingness to establish and defend boundaries with lethal force if necessary.
Then you have magician.
The magician is the intellectual systemizer. This is the archetype of the coder, the engineer, the builder of complex structures and technologies. It is the man who understands the hidden laws of the universe and bends them to create order out of chaos.
And the lover. I feel like this one gets twisted a lot by modern dating culture.
Very much so. Riker is careful to define the lover. It does not mean being a beta provider, constantly supplicating to women, buying them gifts to beg for affection. The integrated lover represents fierce, highly selective desire, passion, and the appreciation of true beauty, completely devoid of desperation.
And finally, the king.
The king is the sovereign self. The king is the archetype that integrates and balances the warrior, the magician, and the lover. The king does not rule through tyranny, but through unshakable competence and a commitment to the hierarchy. He leads justly, rewards merit, and protects the realm. Riker argues that the priesthood of envy and modern feminism have actively tried to castrate and pathologize all 4 of these archetypes. But through parallel structures, men are actively reclaiming them.
And as men reclaim these archetypes and align themselves with this natural hierarchy, the book takes a sudden, fascinating turn into its most metaphysical, almost mystical territory. Section 6 is all about synchronicity and the cosmic node.
This is where Riker circles back to the quantum physics of David Bohm and introduces the psychology of Carl Jung, specifically Jung's concept of synchronicity. Synchronicity is generally defined as the occurrence of meaningful coincidences that seem to have no direct causal link, yet feel profoundly connected.
But Riker puts a very specific hierarchical spin on it. He argues that these profound reality-bending coincidences are not just random chance. He claims they only occur when a man is fully aligned with his natural archetypal role. When you embrace the implicate order, when you act as a true king or warrior, the universe itself recognizes that alignment and starts to send you signals.
When reality winks at you, is the phrase he uses. And the anecdotes he provides in this section read like a thriller. Let's talk about the Navy SEAL.
Riker tells the story of a Navy SEAL operating on a highly dangerous, botched raid in Yemen. The operation goes sideways, communication is jammed, and the SEAL is separated from his unit. In the midst of this chaos, he starts seeing the number 7 everywhere. His compass cracks and the dial sticks on 7. The only radio channel that yields static instead of dead air is channel 7. He takes cover in a ruined building and sees a faded tag on the wall, a massive number 7.
And the payoff to this story is chilling. He follows these intuitive hits, survives the extraction, and years later, while going through classified family records, he discovers that his father, who he never knew, who was presumed dead in a covert operation in Vietnam, served in the elite 7th Special Forces Group.
For Riker, this isn't a spooky coincidence. It is the implicate order manifesting. The SEAL was acting at the absolute apex of the warrior archetype, fully integrated into his hierarchical duty, and the universe provided a harmonic resonance connecting him to his fractal father across time and space.
He also describes a very different kind of synchronicity with a software engineer in Toronto.
Yes, moving from the warrior to the magician archetype. This engineer was stuck for months on an incredibly complex coding problem involving distributed network communication. He hits a wall. Then he starts waking up at exactly 3:33 a.m. Not roughly around 3, but exactly 3:33 on his digital clock for 7 consecutive nights. On the 8th night, he falls into a deep sleep and dreams vividly of ant swarm behavior, the exact fractal hierarchy Riker discussed in Section 1.
The engineer wakes up, realizes the ants use a chemical implicate order to solve network problems, and he codes a breakthrough algorithm that morning that eventually sells for millions.
Riker even scales this concept up to massive cultural figures, pointing to Elon Musk. He notes how Musk's early battery resonance tests for electric vehicles miraculously aligned with a harmonic frequency of 333, which led to a massive breakthrough in energy storage capability. Riker posits that men who are actively building and systemizing reality at a high level tap into the mathematical frequencies of the universe.
It is the ultimate empowering idea. When you are on the right natural path, reality literally leans in to help you build.
But, as with all powerful forces, there is a dark side to this metaphysical coin. Riker is very clear about the consequences of misalignment. If the universe rewards alignment, it ruthlessly punishes inversion. He tells a final cautionary tale about a man named Daniel Lynch.
The story of Daniel Lynch is the tragic inverse of the Navy SEAL.
Lynch was a highly educated man, a Harvard MBA, who fully and enthusiastically bought into the modern egalitarian ideology. He embraced the concept of feminist shared parenting and completely outsourced his male authority within his home to appease his wife's demands for equity.
Riker details how Lynch had these deep primal gut instincts, which Riker frames as the universe desperately trying to send him warning signals that his wife's behavior was erratic and destructive to the children. But Lynch continually suppressed his own logic and instincts because his ideology told him that his male intuition was just patriarchal programming.
He ignored the implicate order. He refused to be the king of his own Holland. And the result? Lynch ends up completely blindsided by a divorce, financially ruined by the family courts, and suffering from severe adrenal fatigue. The last update Riker provides is that this former Harvard MBA is working at a deli counter, estranged from his children, and completely cut off from the synchronicity of the universe. He ignored his fundamental nature, and nature, which is unforgiving, crushed him.
It is a brutal end to the narrative. So if we pull all the way back and synthesize the massive, overarching architecture of Conrad Riker's argument, what are we left with?
It comes down to this absolute core premise. The universe is an unapologetic, immutable hierarchy. Western civilization is currently suffering from a terminal, potentially fatal crisis of holonic inversion, a state where the priesthood of envy has ensured that emotion rules over logic, the parts rebel against the whole, and the feminine imperative is unnaturally placed above the masculine imperative.
It is an incredibly bleak diagnosis of the current system, but his final message isn't despair. It is ultimately a message of radical action.
Yes. His ultimate conclusion is that the current system cannot be reformed from within because the code is entirely corrupted. He urges men to stop asking for permission from a society that despises them. He wants them to aggressively opt out of corrupted gynocentric systems, whether that means corporate jobs, traditional universities, or mainstream media, and use the trivium and physical labor to build parallel structures rooted entirely in nature's immutable laws of order, competence, and hierarchy.
Which leaves us with a truly provocative thought to mull over. We've explored Riker's entire controversial map today. We've looked at the quantum physics, the evolutionary psychology, the collapse of the family, and the rise of parallel economies. So I want you, the listener, to think about this as you go about your day.
If millions of men quietly decide to take Conrad Raker's advice, if they systematically opt out of mainstream corporate, legal, and social structures to build their own parallel, strictly hierarchical, wildly competent, male centric communities, what does the next decade of Western civilization actually look like? Does the current mainstream system simply collapse under its own weight from a lack of participation and a drain of core competence? Or does a new, entirely separate, highly functional societal structure rise up to permanently replace it?
It is, without exaggeration, the defining sociological question of our current cultural moment.
It really is, and we will undoubtedly be watching it unfold. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. As always, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the show so you never miss an analysis. If you are intrigued by the architecture of these arguments and want to dive into the source material we covered today, head over to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to purchase the ebook, Divine Natural Order. And do not forget to follow the author, Conrad Riker, directly at Conrad Riker on Substack to keep up with his latest writings. Until next time, stay sharp and keep questioning the narrative.